Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples, the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 78, The Great Horde Part 3, Mongke Temur. Berke died sometime in either 1266 or 1267 at nearly 60 years of age. The Jochids and the Begs of the Horde assembled for a Quriltai to choose their new Khan. Berke had not designated a successor, and rather than choosing one of his sons, the Quriltai decided that the best way to unite the Horde was to choose one of Batu's grandsons. Even if the Horde was going its own way, no one could forget that Genghis Khan had personally chosen Batu as Jochi's heir. Their choice fell on Mongke Temur, and the line of succession would stay with the Batuids thereafter. This was the beginning of the Great Horde's peak years, from the end of the 1260s through to the mid-1300s, the time of the Pax Mongolica. Under Mongke Temur, the Horde continued to demonstrate flexibility and adaptability. Mongol law was extended to the sedentary peoples he ruled, using administrative practices that the Mongols had already borrowed in earlier conquests. Trade networks were unified, reinforced, and extended. In the east, the Hordeids brought the Siberian fur trade into the Eurasian networks on a scale that had not been seen before, while in the west, Nogai brought the Black Sea coast and Danube fully into the system. As Marie Favoreux writes, from Siberia to Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean, all the participants knew that it was the Horde that made the network run, and they all courted the Khan. The last 20 years had seen massive changes. The Horde was bigger, better organized, and more cohesive than any of the other uluses, and it would outlast all of them. Mongke Temur would further contribute to this. Hulagu's blockade had broken the old Kubi system. The Horde still followed the redistributive practices, but based on its own tribute, trade, farming, and so on, not the Mongol imperial treasury. They had lost the war with the Toluids, but the Toluids had to recognize the Horde's power and could not force them to obey. Hundreds of thousands of conquered subjects were fully integrated into the Horde, at least half of whom were sedentary. Millions more lived in the subjugated territories adjoining the steppe. It now had at least 9 sub-hordes and 3 dominant hordes, which combined to form the ruling regime. The central territory on the Volga belonged to the Batuid Horde. Horde's descendants controlled the Blue Horde in the east, and the Great Horde's preeminent general, Nogai, controlled the west, effectively independent in the territories he had conquered during the campaign against the Byzantines. All these hordes would live together in peace throughout Mongke Temur's reign. The Blue Horde had a large Mongol warrior contingent, maybe the largest of all the hordes across the whole of the Mongol Empire. In addition to the Kingut, the original Mengen that he had inherited from Jochi, there were the followers of the other 4 sons of Jochi who had decided to go with Horde rather than Batu, and thousands of other warriors from the Kongirat, Merkit, Kereit, Naiman, and other tribes had joined over the years. Sources agree that the Ordaids and Batuids remained close, continued to honor the same ancestors, and trusted each other. But in contrast to the adaptable Batuids, contemporary writers also tell us that they were great traditionalists. Marco Polo called them the proper Tartars, strict followers of the Yasa and the old steppe rituals. The Batuids and Nogai's horde might make all the required offerings to Tengri and Etugen, but as we know, many of them were to one degree or another Muslims or Christians. We have no reports of either Muslims or Christians in the Blue Horde. They maintained the old, purely nomadic lifestyle. Marco Polo said that they had no cities, no castles, and lived always on the wide plains, the great mountains, or the valleys. As we'll see in the next episode, this was absolutely not the case under the Central and Western Hordes. And around the edges of the Blue Horde's territory, the lower Sirdaria, the Chu, Sari-Su, Turgai, and Ishim valleys, settlements were, in fact, starting to appear. The Blue Horde's territory was the Western Siberian plain, inhospitable, swampy, and mostly wilderness. It was the center of the Mongol lands, surrounded by other hordes, with no real options for expansion. The Batuids lay west, of course. Southwest was the Ulus of Chagatai, southeast the Ulus of Ogaday, and east was the territory of the Great Khan. But it had one advantage: no major sedentary populations to deal with. Siberian fur hunters and traders were also nomads. It was easier to get along. The Blue Horde stands out among the Mongols for their lack of belligerence. They always knew what was going on in the other hordes and often got involved in controversies, whether among the Jochids, the Chagatids, or the Tuluids. But as diplomats, giving them an important role in maintaining contact among the different branches of the fracturing empire. Contemporary sources agree that the Ordaids were autonomous, as was appropriate for the horde of the elder son of Jochi, but they fully aligned themselves voluntarily with the Batuids, and, as Rashid al-Din reports, wrote the name of Batu's successor at the head of their decrees. Mongke Temur began his rule by refusing to go and make his submission to the great Khan Kubilai, thus declaring that he would follow the path of independence marked out by Batu and Berke. But Kubilai sent his envoys to the Volga with gifts and a blessing for his accession. It was not a hostile split, and they would try to get along on mutually beneficial terms. There were solid pragmatic considerations here too. Mongke Temur did not have a claim to be Great Khan, as the Jochids were out of the running, but he had the biggest ulus, a large and loyal family, and considerable wealth. He enjoyed respect from the Golden family and gave respect back. Mongke Temur began his reign with monetary reform, issuing new silver coins with his name and tamga, and no reference to the Great Khan. He established new mints and used different coin designs in different regions. The coin's value was still based on the metal it was made from, so this did not affect buying power, but any coin that was not authorized by the Khan was declared officially worthless. Coins were minted in Khwarezm for the east, in Sarai for the center, Crimea for the west, and Bulgar for the north. Coin usage was often seasonal. People's day-to-day lives were still far from monetized. People needed money when they went to one of the trade fairs to sell that year's pelts or to pay taxes. Wealthier merchants could even order their own coins. They would take an ingot of silver, which could have come from anywhere across the trade network, to the mint, and for a small minting charge and a fee to the Khan, they could have it converted into coins. While things were harmonious in the Great Horde, there was more trouble among the Mongols in Central Asia. This time, the conflict was between Ogedei's heir, Kaidu, and Chagatai's heir, Barak. These two neighbours both wanted to continue expanding their uluses, which resulted in both claiming the same territory. Mongke Temur used his position on the sidelines to exploit the situation for his own benefit and to get one over on the Toluids. The rise of the Toluids had pushed both the Chagatids and Ogedeids down the pecking order, and Kublai had exacerbated the situation by making a gift to Barak of territories that Kaidu had conquered and had no intention of letting go. Kaidu also wanted Samarkand and Bukhara, which Barak held. This meant that the expansionist Barak was up against the borders of the Great Horde, and that he had Kublai's support, a potentially dangerous situation for Mongke Temur. So, when Kaidu lost his first battle against Barak on the Siadaria, he sent a request for help to the Horde. Mongke Temur agreed and sent his uncle, Berke, with 50,000 men. These troops reversed the course of the campaign. Barak took heavy losses and was forced to withdraw back towards Bukhara and Samarkand, where he hoped to raise more soldiers. Kaidu and Mongke Temur were in agreement that they did not wish to cause any more destruction in the region, and they opened peace negotiations. Kaidu called a Quriltai on the plain of Talas in spring 1269. Kubilai, Abaka, the new Khan of the Ilkhanids, and all the rest of the Toluids were not invited. It was Kaidu for the Chagatids, Berke for the Jochids, and Barak for the Ogedeids only. The incident's regarded as a classic case of Mongke Temur's skill at balancing the interests of the various powers in play, and is a perfect example of the Great Horde not being the unthinking, wild and rapacious savages that stereotypes would have you believe. Barak had lost, but making peace meant not humiliating him. Instead, he was made an ally. The three uluses decided that they would share the tax revenue of Transoxiana, 2/3 to Barak, 1/3 divided between Kaidu and Mongke Temur, and nothing would be sent to Kubilai. Barak lost Bukhara and would take part of Khorasan instead. Abaka thought that Khorasan belonged to the Ilkhans, but Barak said that it had never been granted to them, and Mongke Temur and Kaidu agreed. If it came to war, they were willing to back him. The Quriltai was another step in the fracturing of the Mongol Empire. What is a great Khan if territories are divvied up and revenue shared without consulting him? Effectively, Kaidu, Barak and Mongke Temur were showing that every Khan was just a Khan, cousins ruling their own uluses and holding equal status. Of course, this did not mean that any alliance was forever. They would continue to have their own aims and plans, and conflict would always be just over the horizon. It did not take long for this to be illustrated. Berke did indeed go to war with the Ilkhanids, supported by reinforcements from Kaidu. But the campaign did not go well, and Kaidu called his men home. Then he switched sides to Abaka. In the summer of 1270, Abaka defeated the Chagataids. Berke died, and his commanders and officials went to offer their service to Kaidu. Kaidu accepted the offer and swallowed Berke's people into his own horde. Kaidu got what he wanted, but it was a clear blow for Mongke Temur, leaving the Ilkhanids more secure than ever. His reaction was pragmatic. Swallowing Berke's ulus made Kaidu stronger, a rival for Kubilai who might cast an acquisitive eye at Jochid territory too. So, to keep his options open, he sent Abaka a gift of falcons and hawks, traditionally gifts for an equal, and congratulated him on his victory. The next incident came in 1276. A group of Toluid princes rebelled against Kubilai, accusing him of going native after moving his capital to Shangdu. They captured Kubilai's son, Nomukan, along with one of the Great Khan's generals. To try to bring Kaidu in, they sent him the general, and they sent Nomukan to Mongke Temur. Mongke Temur again acted only in his own interests. He did not join the rebels or harm Nomukan. Instead, he kept him as a hostage and did not get involved. Mongke Temur's policies with regard to other Mongols had mixed results. He maintained trade access, acquired some additional revenue, and built his reputation as a kind of elder statesman to the other Khans who sought his help and support. On the other hand, his support for Kaidu ended up leading to long-term conflicts between Kaidu and Kubilai that affected all the other Mongols too, and the Ilkhanid threat was not dealt with either. But Mongke Temur had more than just Mongol rivals to deal with. Two other major factors were his non-Mongol subjects and relations with the rest of Europe. He found himself in a changing situation compared to his predecessors, and would need to continue to display the adaptability that had characterized the Jochids. The Jochids had millions of sedentary subjects. It was not just a question of how to rule them, it was a question of identity. The other uluses will end up assimilated by the Chinese, Persians, and Turkic peoples of Central Asia. The Great Horde is not assimilated by its largest group of subjects, the Rus. Partly this was due to the size of the steppe territory available to them compared to other uluses, which enabled the Jochids to live separately from their sedentary subjects in a way the others could not. But it was also down to the system of rule that Mongke Temur established, which was different to the ways Mongols ruled in other places. In Western international relations, Mongke Temur was not an invader like Batu, or a Muslim like Berke. He was the ruler of an already well-established kingdom that dominated Eurasian trade and was in regular communication with both the Caliph and the Pope. Europe's religious and political systems were different to those the Mongols had known in Asia and would also require adaptation. We've already covered the Mongols' first attempts to deal with the Rus from the Rus point of view. After being left alone for several years after the initial invasion, we saw the Mongols move to conduct censuses and impose taxes. The dual administration system of Baskaks and Darukhachi the Mongols had adopted and adapted in their Central Asian conquests and had already successfully applied elsewhere, was also introduced in the north. But here it was less successful. There was strong resistance and rebellions. The Rus particularly objected to their men being conscripted for the Horde's wars in the south. In administering the Rus, the Mongols were facing different problems to those they had encountered elsewhere. The governing institutions and economy of Rus were very different to Central Asia and Eastern Asia. There was far less urbanization and correspondingly a much more dispersed population. Agriculture was a much smaller part of the economy and sometimes failed altogether. Major centers like Novgorod were dependent on food brought in from elsewhere. And as we all well know, the Rus were politically extremely fragmented and lacked centralization. Finally, they inhabited a region outside the steppe that was not conducive to Mongol lifestyles. From a Mongol perspective, this all meant that the Rus could not be absorbed into the Horde, and they could not be controlled by garrisons stationed throughout their territory. Instead, they chose the approach which we've already seen illustrated with Alexander Nevsky: closer engagement with the Rus elite, knyazes, boyars, and the church. This approach was systematized under Mongke Temur, who issued the Orthodox Church its first yarlik, and ordered his envoys to wait outside towns for the money to be brought to them when they went to collect taxes. In Central Asia, the Mongols had taken the land from the nobles and redistributed it to suit their purposes. In Rus, the knyazes and the boyars' domains were not touched, and property was never taxed. Goods, agricultural and craft production, trade, and some natural resources were taxed, but there was a much lighter administrative touch than elsewhere in the Mongol Empire. Remember the Mongol redistribution system we discussed a couple of episodes back? The Mongols made it clear to the Rus elite that they too would receive their share if they did what they were told. They kept their places in the traditional Rus hierarchy and had all the trappings of status that they were used to go along with their yarliks. The Mongols were not all stick and no carrot. They offered benefits to their subjects too. We've noted the Pax Mongolica, the ability of merchants and travellers in Mongol territory to go where they wanted without fear of thieves or brigands, and the Mongols tried to extend this into Rus territory as well. Only the knyazes and their retinues were allowed to go about armed or ride war horses. Everyone else was banned from carrying weapons. Tarkhan status, the special tax-free status for valuable people, was also given out to those whose support the Mongols wanted: valuable artisans, wealthy and influential merchants, and, especially, the clergy. By accepting their yarlik and Tarkhan status, the Church was declaring that it supported the legitimacy of Mongol rule, regardless of whether it never publicly admitted it, or whether its writings continued to talk about godless Tartars and pagans. Mongke Temur kept the boyars loyal by securing their domains, and kept the Church loyal with privileges and opportunities to acquire wealth. With the elites on the Khan's side, the knyazes also had to fall into line. There was no support for resistance. And if the carrot was not enough, The steppe and the Horde's armies were always just days away. Mongke Temur also endeavoured to restore peaceful relations with Byzantium after Michael Palaeologus had reneged on his agreement with the Mamluks and been punished by Nogai's campaign. The emperor had already made overtures to Berke, who had not been ready to forgive him. When Berke died, Michael tried again, sending a large consignment of textiles as tribute, and the offer of his daughter as a bride. Mongke Temur accepted the tribute and gave the princess Euphrosyne to Nogai. For the Jochids, this was at least partially the result of the end of the war with the Ilkhanids and the improvement in relations. Although the Byzantines remained allies with the Ilkhans, that was no longer a reason for the Horde to avoid peace. The Horde remained in alliance with the Mamluks, and the restoration of relations with the Byzantines gave their trade a boost. The Mongols were still sending Baibars slaves. What Mongke Temur wanted from the Mamluks was medicine, especially anything alleged to prolong life. The return of good relations with the Byzantines, and therefore better access to the Black Sea, also boosted Genoa's relations with the Mongols. Genoa and Venice had long been rivals in this region, and the Genoese wanted to use the connections they had already built up through their base in Sudak and time in Berke's court to dominate the Black Sea trade. For their part, the Mongols wanted a partner with naval capabilities. Mongke Temur was willing to welcome the Genoese as long as they were willing to pay their taxes and follow Mongol law. Sometime around 1281, he granted them permission to take Kaffa, a tiny old Greek settlement on the southeast coast of Crimea. They expanded and fortified it, and made it into a rival to Sudak. So Crimea returned to its old role of the commercial connection between the steppe and the Mediterranean world. And the Venetians were not entirely squeezed out either. They set up their colony on the eastern coast of the Azov Sea, where the River Don provided a connection to Ryazan. Land routes opened by Nogai's southern conquests also remained important, and the whole area in what is now Moldova and Romania became a key winter camping region for the Mongols. Here they built their own towns or developed existing settlements. Nogai set up his capital at Isakir in Romania. Other important cities included Kilia on the Danube and Setatia Alba, or White City, on the Dniester. These trading hubs attracted settlers, often Muslim, although Nogai seems to have been Tengrist, Muslim, Buddhist, or Christian, as he thought the situation required. A new route appeared between White City through Galicia-Volhynia to Poland, the Via Tartarica. Lviv, at the other hand, was a German-controlled city at this time and a member of the Hanseatic League. The Via Tartarica provided a land route between the German cities and their Genoese partners, as an alternative to the maritime route from the Baltic coast around Europe and through the Mediterranean. Everywhere, the Mongols acted as we've already seen, facilitating trade, providing infrastructure, protecting merchants and their goods. Everyone, Germans, Italians, Byzantines, Muslims, conducted their trade using Jochid coins and paid Jochid taxes. Mongke Temur was a highly successful ruler. He brought stability to the Horde and entrenched an administrative system unique to the Mongol world to rule the Rus. Rus elites were incentivized to be loyal to the Khan, while retaining their own way of life. Ordinary Rus people continued to live as they had previously. They were ruled by their own lords and worshipped their own way in their own churches. This system was a buffer between the Rus and the Mongols that meant that each kept their own identity without the assimilation that took place in the other Uluses. Mongke Temur maneuvered wisely in international relations, reinforcing the Horde's dominant position in Eurasian trade and staying friendly with both Muslim and Christian neighbors. All this resulted in an economic boom and a virtuous circle of development as the Pax Mongolica took hold. But the growing wealth will also eventually create rival centers of power. Join me next episode as we wrap up this short series on the Horde with a look at how the Bulgars and other peoples were integrated into the Horde and what we know about life on the steppe during this period. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.